right. Okay, we are going to move on to the sage grouse hunting. Commissioner Vogler, informational. Commission will consider and may take action to close the 2011 sage grouse season. If you recall, item B has been tabled, so we're dealing with item A, but basically the informational part sounds like it covers both, kind of both. So we have two presentations that they're going to be made by Sean Espinoza. And so anyway, Sean, with that, why don't you go ahead and get started.
Once again, for the record, Sean Espinoza with Nevada Department of Wildlife. I'm the Upland Game Staff Specialist with the department, and I've got to say that I'm pleased that the item wasn't completely tabled, because we did spend a considerable amount of time putting some material together in response to this, and this is something that the department really takes seriously, and we really exercise our due diligence with sage grouse hunting. And as opposed to all other game birds, we spend, like I said, a considerable amount of time estimating populations and looking at how these populations are doing and making recommendations based on that. So I'll see if I can figure out how this little deal works here. So just to address our current season structure as it sits right now, we have a season established from September 25th through October 9th, and it is a 15-day total season length. Our bag limit is 2 and our possession limit is 4, which it's been for some time. We do have, separate from the general hunt, we do have a separate 2-day hunt in the Desotoy Range, which straddles Churchill County and Lander County. And that is just a 2-day season, and the limit there is 2 and 4 as well. And then we also have the still popular Sheldon Special Sage Grouse Hunt, which is 2 separate 2-day seasons, and there's 75 permits that are allocated in each one of those seasons. Okay. So this graph represents our long-term harvest trend and number of hunters, and you can see there back in the late 60s and 70s, sage grouse hunters were taking between 20 and 30,000 birds on an annual basis. More recently, that total has dropped to between 5 and 10,000 birds, but if you look at the number of hunters, there's definitely a correlation there between number of hunters and harvest, and I think that that's held true throughout most of time, and it is pretty particular with most upland game species. We've seen a considerable jump in harvest over the last 2 years, and also consistent with that, the number of hunters as well. Along with this harvest data, we do collect a considerable amount of wing data. We have 75 wing barrels around the state, and hunters are also encouraged to turn those wings in after harvest. And what that wing data allows us to do is estimate production from year to year. It also allows us to estimate nest success by looking at the adult hens, so we can tell quite a bit of information from year to year about what is going on with that population. We actually use that information to help us estimate what the fall population is going to be. I'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but we do use lek counts to kind of establish a baseline information in the springtime. Then we couple that with expanding upon that by, we know that we're only counting about 75% of the birds at any given time on a lek. You're not going to see every single bird that's out there attending a lek on any given day. even on leks that we monitor quite a bit. Now, for a fall population, we take a sex ratio based off of our wing data, and we basically take the number of males and times it by that sex ratio, and then we also include production for the year. If we're anywhere around a production value of say 2, sage grouse are doing pretty well. Any production value upwards of 2 chicks per hen is usually a pretty good production value. Any time we get around 1.7 or below that, then we know that we've had probably a poor or stable production year. Something that we ascribe to for each one of our populations are these Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency management guidelines. There are 3 specific points that we make sure that we follow regarding each one of our sage grouse populations. And I'll just read these off to you really quick. If populations are declining for 3 or more consecutive years or trends are unknown, seasons and bag limits should be conservative. And that's kind of where we fall right now. Even where we have populations that are doing pretty well, we have a 1 or 2 bird daily bag limit and a 1 to 4 week season. So we fall within that. Where populations are hunted, harvest rate should not exceed 10% of the estimated fall population. And I'll show you a table that has what we estimate to be our fall population statewide for sage grouse. And this is to minimize negative effects on the subsequent year's breeding population. And you guys have heard quite a bit about additive versus compensatory mortality, so I won't go into that too much further unless you guys have specific questions afterwards. But and then population should not be hunted where we have less than 300 birds comprising our breeding population. And I would say that we even go beyond that in many cases. We have several populations around the state where we have 600 plus birds that we still do not recommend a hunting season for. So here's our harvest since 2004, since the last 6 years. And it ranges from 3,000 to last year we saw a real bump in harvest up to almost 9,000 birds. And estimated fall populations that range from roughly 115,000 birds all the way up to 155,000 birds. So it's fairly robust in terms of those numbers, and our total percentage of harvest ranges between 2% and then that 6.3% which you see for 2009. And one of the only things that would I can attribute to that bump potentially is the listing decision that came out in March. I think that probably drove some folks into the field because they know or they feel that time is limited for sage grouse hunting. So we've probably seen a jump in sage grouse hunters mainly because of that. Prior to that, it was between 2 and 3% of our estimated fall population. So that would definitely fall within a compensatory classification in terms of harvesting birds that would probably die throughout the rest of the year anyway. Areas and units closed since 1997. Prior to that, there really wasn't too many units that were closed. It was open on a statewide basis where we had sage grouse. Guys could go out and hunt pretty much in any county that had the birds. Since then, we've closed 5 entire counties and 20 hunt units. The entire Nevada portion of the bi-state population has been closed, and it's been closed for 14 years. All of Pershing, which has been heavily affected by wildfire, has been closed for several years now. Lincoln County has been closed since 1997, and most of Churchill County except Unit 184. 3 units in Elko County have been closed. 5 units or portions of 5 units have been closed in Humboldt County, 2 in Lander, 4 in Nye County, 2 in Washoe County, and 3 units in White Pine County. So, we do consider each unit with a very scrutinous eye, and if there's any question, then we err on the side of conservatism. Just to get into this bi-state population thing, because this is very important. As I mentioned, it has not had a season in 14 years. Currently, the bi-state population has a listing priority number of 3, as opposed to the greater sage-grouse population, which has a listing priority number of 8. And what that means is the Fish and Wildlife Service goes through a ranking process, and the higher up the scale you move, the closer to listing you are. And 8, I think the scale goes from 1 to 10 or 1 to 11. But if you're 8 to 10, then the chances of listing in the immediate future anyway, within the next 3 years, are probably not that great. However, with the bi-state population having a listing priority number of 3, you're getting pretty darn close to facing a possible listing as a distinct population segment. Population numbers on the Nevada side either are declining or remaining at stable levels, even in spite of the cessation of sage-grouse hunting. So it's not sage-grouse hunting that's driving these populations one way or another. And I'll show some information later that shows that the Fish and Wildlife Service is following that same track. Existing peer-reviewed research, Connolly et al. 2000 found that predation was the most common cause of death for radio-marked sage-grouse. And that's even written into our conservation plan, that it's the fate of pretty much every sage-grouse out there to be eaten by something at some point during its life cycle. He did find that there were gender-specific differences in harvest, and that oftentimes it was the females that were harvested more than the males, and that had to do with probably more the timing of the season than anything else. During his work, a total of 504 birds were radio marked, of which only 36 or 7.1% were shot by hunters, and that was during a period from 1977 to 1995. In a more recent study, and this goes back to some work that we did back in 2001 through 2005, Sedinger found no support for additive effect of harvest on survival in 2 separate study areas, including North Park in Colorado and the Montana Mountains in Nevada. And the interesting thing about that is the Montana Mountains are probably the most hunted sage-grouse population in the state of Nevada. There's more concentration there of hunters than we have anywhere else. So we became concerned back in 2000 about the number of birds that were being harvested in that area. So we conducted a fairly long-term, a 5-year marking study in the Montana Mountains, and we were finding that through our own basic Lincoln Index modeling effort that we were harvesting between 8 and 11% of the fall population each year. We gave that data to Jim Sedinger at UNR, and he basically found the same thing with other different types of high-powered statistical modeling efforts. So we were pretty happy with those results, and they were pretty consistent. And during that study, there was over 1,000 birds that were marked during that study, and we had 137 recoveries. Some ongoing research that's ongoing right now. Jim Sedinger, Eric Blomberg, Mike Atami, and Dan Nani have worked on a project out in Eureka County, Nevada for the last almost 10 years now. And they're assessing the effects of a large-scale utility line through Eureka County. And you might ask yourself, well, what does that have to do with hunting? But during that effort, they've marked a tremendous amount of birds, and if it pleases the commission, I'm going to have Eric, who's here today, come and explain some things that they have done. But they've banded 852 male sage grouse, of which 30 have been shot and reported. So 3.5% of what they've marked have actually been shot and reported by hunters. And a total of 312 females have been captured and banded, of which 9 were actually recovered by hunters. So with that, I'd like to bring Eric up, and he's going to go into more detail on that because they're looking specifically recently at the effects of harvest on marked birds.
Thanks, Eric Blomberg, University of Nevada, Reno. Like Sean said, I'm a graduate student working on this research project in Eureka County. I've been involved with the project since 2008. We are essentially out on the ground conducting field investigations from the beginning of the breeding season in March until, in recent years, until following the hunting season in October. We begin in the beginning of the season by some pretty substantial capture and banding efforts on the breeding leks. And through the course of that, we've marked, those are 852 unique males. Most of those primarily get metal and plastic leg bands, similar to the wood duck project that Chris Nicolai was talking about earlier. We also mark all of the females we capture with radio telemetry collars. The collars are motion sensitive so that once a female is killed or dies in some manner, the signal rate changes and we're able to detect that as a mortality versus the bird still being alive, so we don't actually have to physically observe the bird. As Sean mentioned, we've really gotten a fairly small number of returns. All of the bands are marked with our telephone number. All the radio collars are marked with that telephone number. Every year we have hunters calling in and reporting those. From 2008 through 2010, we wanted to get a better idea of what was happening with these populations during the fall period. Traditionally, we had only monitored the birds from the spring breeding season until the end of the brood rearing period, and we had sort of this missing piece of information which included the hunting season. So during that time, we had 134 of those radio marked individuals out. For those familiar with the areas, this is primarily on Roberts Creek Mountain and the Cortez Range in Eureka County. And as it says up there, of those 134 birds, we only had 3 birds during that entire 3-year period that we could associate with hunting. 2 of them were shot and reported to us directly, and then a third was found dead on the ground, and we were able to bring it in, take it to the Nevada vet lab with Perry Wolf, and do an x-ray of it and determine that it had shot in it. So we had 1 bird that we determined was a crippling loss. So taken together in those 3 years, we had fewer than 2% of our female sage grouse killed by hunters. And just anecdotally, in some of these areas, we have fairly high hunting pressure and a fairly large number of radio marked birds, where you'll have an area with several groups of hunters working a small basin that I know for a fact has 20 to 30 radio marked birds, and they'll spend, a 2-week or a 2-day weekend in there, and we'll maybe have 1 or 2 reported from that area. So I think it just sort of underscores the fact that we know the WAFWA guidelines suggest 10% harvest to be a safe level of harvest. We've got the work done by Jim and Sean in the Montana mountains, where they were able to verify that, because in that study they determined 9% roughly harvest had no measurable impact on survival of the birds. And then we've got this nice comparison with Eureka County, where probably the harvest pressure is quite a bit lower than in some place like the Montana mountains, and we're seeing substantially lower rates of harvest as a result.
I'm going to kind of switch gears here and focus a little bit on the Endangered Species Act listing, and I have another presentation on this too, but I think it's important to know what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looks at when they are determining whether or not a species should be listed. There's 5 listing factors. The present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of habitat or range, overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes, which is where hunting would fall into. Disease and predation, we definitely know that West Nile virus now is a factor, a mortality factor. Inadequacy of regulatory mechanisms to protect the species habitat, and other natural or man-made factors affecting the species' continued existence. So those are the 5 things that the Fish and Wildlife Service by statute, by federal regulation, must evaluate. So in 2010, when the Fish and Wildlife Service came out with their finding, they determined that listing factor A and listing factor D posed the most significant threats to greater sage grouse. So, in my opinion, that is what we should be focused on. It has everything to do with present or threatened destruction of habitat or regulatory mechanisms to protect that habitat. I think it's pretty clear now where the Fish and Wildlife Service has identified where the issue is. In the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service prior finding in 2005, they looked at 19 different threats to the species. And they had a panel of 7 experts review those 19 different threats, and they found that hunting ranked 16th out of 19. The top 4 threats identified were invasive species, which we're not immune to in terms of cheatgrass and medusa head. Infrastructure, and a lot of that is infrastructure associated with energy development, particularly in Wyoming with oil and gas development, roads, transmission lines, and fences. Wildfires, which we certainly know about here in Nevada, and then agricultural conversion to cropland. So, even though the cessation of sage-grouse hunting may be viewed by some as a conservation action, the decision to move sage-grouse up or down the listing priority scale will have little to do with recreational hunting. And I think that the Fish and Wildlife Service has been pretty clear on that this is not a population numbers issue, this is all about a habitat issue. Other states, sage-grouse are currently hunted in 9 of the 11 states. With the exception of Washington. They haven't hunted sage-grouse in 20 years in Washington, and their population is somewhat stable now, but is very small compared to what it was prior. North Dakota closed hunting for its small population in 2008 and 2009, and that was due to low elk attendance that they saw, largely in response to what they feel was a loss in population numbers due to West Nile virus. I must say too that the Department of Wildlife, through our license dollars, basically is able to garner grant funding. If we couldn't hunt the species anymore, then whether or not we could use license dollars would be questionable. But we receive up to $400,000 to $6,000 each year in federal match on our grant, which allows us to conduct population monitoring and conduct projects on the ground. And lastly, I just put this in there to demonstrate that sage-grouse currently occupy 56% of its historic range. And that is not due to hunting. That is largely due to conversion of these areas, whether it's development or agricultural conversion, particularly in the northern Oregon, Washington area, the Snake River Plain, and areas of Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. So those are the areas that you can see the major differences in terms of historic versus current range, and that didn't have anything to do with hunting. So I do have a separate presentation based on what the agenda item asks for in terms of what we've done to address this endangered species listing, but at this point I'll break for any questions you might have on hunting.
Just to be clear then, if we stay under the 10%, then we're in the compensatory category, and so therefore the hunt really has no impact based on that.
We feel pretty comfortable with that, but only really in our Montana mountains populations do we approach that level. Most of our other populations are 6% or below.
Any other questions?
Is there any crops at all that the sage hen kind of take a liking to? Like pheasants, you can find them in cornfields and sugar beets and all kinds of different places.
Yeah, that's a good question. Alfalfa pivots often are utilized by sage grouse. The fringe of alfalfa pivots around the state, particularly in central and eastern Nevada, are used as brood rearing habitat. And in some cases, even in the bi-state area, where we do have some artificial irrigation going on in hay meadows or with alfalfa pivots, that is largely the brood rearing habitat for these birds in certain areas.
One follow-up question. Obviously, with the closure of quite a few units around the state, is there some that are borderline that you couldn't decide one way or the other, so you went ahead and left them open, or?
There are a few that would be considered borderline, but we often err towards the side of conservatism and we leave them closed unless there's a compelling reason to open them.
And you publicize that when you're giving your reports to the
Yeah.
feds, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Thanks.
they always ask about that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Rain?
Thank you. Just on the perception issue, just a question, what has NDOW seen in the way of perception of hunting of sage grouse associated with the Endangered Species Act, when, you know, when you're talking with federal agencies, people, do they, is there a perception problem that hunting is a bad thing? Is it okay? I mean, I'm gathering that it's okay, but I just wanna make sure I remember that. And then also, if you could kind of go over what would happen if it did become listed. Listed tomorrow, then we would have to do X.
The perception issue in terms of the Fish and Wildlife Service or the perception issue in terms of the public?
Yeah, both, please. Separate issues, but.
The perception issue from the Fish and Wildlife perspective, and this is where you should probably have somebody like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here to give that side of the story, but in my opinion, the perception from that side is that hunting is not the issue. The perception on the public side, I can't really speculate as to that. Sorry, I can just give you, you know, what the data is telling me, basically. Maybe some of the advisory board members or the public that's here would comment on that.
Commissioner Rowe?
There's a matrix that lists the rankings of threats to the sage hen. Where does hunting rank, and do you know what ranks above that? Off the top of your head, just a few.
I think I provided that in one of the slides, but there's 16th out of 19th on the ranking scale, but I think importantly it's probably beneficial to bring out that when we did the local planning process, each one of the population management units had a plan developed for it. And within that plan, there was a ranking matrix for each one of those PMUs. And so oftentimes hunting fell out as a very low threat on the totem pole when they went through that ranking process. I can't really think of any PMU that had hunting ranked as a top 4 problem. Usually it had to do with habitat quality, habitat quantity, wildfire, invasive species, that type of thing.
Go ahead, Commissioner Rain.
I think the other half of my question, I apologize for asking multiple part questions, I get hard to remember, was if hunting, if they do become endangered, then what would be the implications for hunting?
At that point, it falls under federal jurisdiction, so it would be taken out of the state's hands at that point. There is a 4D exception. We still fish for Lahontan cutthroat trout. So they could elect to go with some system like that, but I can't say for sure. And that would probably be in only populations that were very robust, that they would allow for any type of take like that. But that's under a 4D ruling. And in a lot of cases, our Lahontan cutthroat trout are under catch and release. We don't have that ability with sage grouse. But that's all I can comment on for that. Steve Abel would be a good person to have here to ask that question to.
Commissioner Drew?
Thanks, Sean. Good presentation. Just a couple quick questions. Following up, you mentioned the sage grouse hunt on the Sheldon, which is managed by Fish and Wildlife Service, obviously. What's been their role in kind of setting and determining that season? Have they been a cooperator, supportive of the hunt? What's been kind of their take in that regard?
They've been supportive of the hunt. They definitely had some concerns early on. Before we went to the permit system, you know, the issue up there was really camping and if there was enough area. But we weren't getting participation for the Sheldon. That was one of the big issues. And then all of a sudden, you know, you turn it into a special use permit and then you attract attention to it and people want to put in for it. And we had, you know, a kind of a long-term study going on back then too, when Mike Gregg was doing his work up there. They've been supportive. They've been instrumental in collecting wings for us and getting us those wings after the season's over with.
Okay, and that feeds perfectly into my next question, which is, given the hypothetical circumstance that hunting goes away, is there any feasible means for you to do your population estimates to the same degree of accuracy that you've been able to do so far?
We would still continue to do leg counts, although that's questionable as well, you know, because it's federal jurisdiction. They don't have the manpower or the personnel to be able to do that type of work. So I don't know how that would, you know, trickle down to the states. But we would lose that ability to do fall population estimates because we would not have any recruitment data. The only way we'd be able to do it is to extrapolate from existing research that's going on, which is a very, you know, point scale type deal on the entire landscape of the species.
Okay, looks like no further comment from the commission on that. Are you done or with your whole presentation, or was there another piece?
There's still a second part of it.
Okay, so go ahead on that then.
Okay. So once again, Sean Espinoza for the record, up on Game Staff Specialist. This addresses the other portion of the agenda item regarding what the Nevada Department of Wildlife has done. And it asks for actions basically over the last year, but I think that sells us short a little bit in terms of what's going on over the last 10 years. So this presentation kind of summarizes that as best I can in a short amount of time anyway. So we began a conservation planning efforts under Governor Kenny Gwynn back in 2001. Actually, it was 2000 when he assembled the Governor's Sage Grouse Conservation Team. The first product they put out was the Nevada Sage Grouse Conservation Strategy, which was completed in October of 2001. And that basically set up the framework for the conservation planning effort that was done and broke the state down into local working groups and PMUs and provided guidelines on how to handle conservation planning for the species. The Governor's Sage Grouse Conservation Plan, otherwise known as the Nevada and Eastern California Greater Sage Grouse Conservation Plan, was completed in 2004. And that was basically an amalgamation of all the recommendations that were made by the local working groups and took specific information out of the population management unit plans as well. And then in just 2010, and somewhat of an offshoot of that conservation plan was a Nevada Energy and Infrastructure Standards to conserve greater sage grouse in their habitats. And that was a product that was completed because at the time that the conservation plan was completed, energy development wasn't viewed as a major threat to sage grouse habitat. That's changed today with the immense amount of renewable energy exploration and development that could take place in Nevada. We've certainly seen that in a number of environmental assessments and EISs that we've reviewed recently. And I'll just go over the projects that we've implemented since 2001. There's been a total of 27 different sage-grouse specific type projects we've implemented since 2001. There's 11 fire restoration projects, 14 brood rearing or nesting habitat improvement projects, and 2 habitat protection projects. During that time frame, we've also implemented 2 long-term research projects as well. And you just heard Eric describe one of those long-term projects, which we've helped fund for the last 10 years. The total treated acreage is a little over 70,000 acres at a cost of $2.3 million. And this is basically our population management unit map of Nevada. And this shows where the projects have taken place. And we've tried to be somewhat strategic in implementation of these projects and placing them in core breeding habitat, which is depicted by those light peach colored circles that you see on there. As discussed in my other presentation, we've done a tremendous amount of monitoring of the species, especially since the late 1990s. You can see there the bars represent the number of trend leks, which is basically our most reliable active leks that we count at least 3 times annually. That number has increased from basically less than 10 in the 1960s to almost 50 trend grounds. And we have what we estimate about 900 active leks in Nevada, and we get to about 500 of those with the personnel that we have, which is pretty substantial. And volunteers also help out, as well as personnel from other agencies. You could definitely see that, you know, from 1960 to about 1985, the population was on a pretty steep downward trend, and that's reflected in some separate statistical analysis as well. But since then, the population somewhat stabilized to the point where in 2005, we were actually getting lek counts in some of our areas that were the highest that we had ever observed anyway. As I mentioned earlier as well, one of the things that we spend a tremendous amount of time on as an agency is reviewing leasing, right-of-ways, and environmental assessments, and EISs. Like I mentioned, there is a tremendous amount going on in the landscape right now. Mining gold prices are at our all-time high, so we're seeing a lot of mining projects come online. Leasing for geothermal, oil and gas, right-of-ways for wind energy development are occurring at a rate that I have not seen in my career. So we do spend a tremendous amount of time responding to those, and if you've ever reviewed an EIS, it's somewhat like reading a dictionary. It can get pretty dry at times, and it's not an easy task. And sometimes it's multiple dictionaries you have to review. And so we review these things to make sure that the leases or right-of-ways are not placed in priority sage-grouse habitat, although some of them already have been. And I'll show a map of that here in a minute. Some of the other things that we've worked on are mapping products. Mapping products are extremely useful to the federal agencies and what they allow and what they don't allow in certain areas. We have seasonal sage-grouse habitat delineations. We have our statewide lek database and lek map, which is pretty comprehensive at this point in time. We have a statewide telemetry location database, which is also comprehensive. There's over 31,000 records in that database. We have our NDOW core breeding habitat delineation, which is currently being used by agencies. Our range-wide management zone and statewide core breeding density models, which were actually, that was contracted out with the BLM to Audubon. We have our statewide restoration, which is basically a sagebrush habitat classification value map. It represents the condition of the sagebrush is actually in right now. And then a future habitat categorization map, which will show priority sage-grouse habitats in Nevada. This map just depicts the the number of telemetry locations that have been collected either through research or by our own efforts since 1995. Really, we didn't have much prior to that, but it's a pretty comprehensive data set. This is our core breeding habitat model, and this basically is a representation of about a 3-mile buffer around each active lek in Nevada. This has been sort of a pet peeve of mine since the sage grouse conservation planning effort started. We never had a habitat classification map that showed what the condition of sagebrush was across the state. What this basically shows is anywhere in the yellow is R0 habitat. That's your best quality sagebrush habitat. That's where you have good understories, a quality sagebrush component within that habitat. R1s are perennial grassland. That's your green. Oftentimes what we see is that's high elevation habitat that's burned in the past. It's coming back as a perennial grassland. Your blue habitat there is basically where we have a canopy, high canopy of sagebrush, but little in the way of understory. So there's something missing there, whether it's forbs or grasses. R3 habitats, the brown is where we have a high density of pinyon juniper and it's crossing a threshold. The R4 habitats, or the red, are basically where we've converted over to a cheatgrass landscape. And then we have some transitional habitats that I won't go into here, but the take-home message here is that when we first created this map, it was a rougher model of this, but the yellow habitat is shrinking from what we developed back in 2005. So that's what's of concern to us, but we still have some options in terms of conversion back to quality habitat from some of the perennial grasslands. And we also have some options in some of our R2 habitats. So the green, the yellow, and the blue here are still what's considered important sage grouse habitats in the state, but the yellow are the most important stuff right now. The threats to the species that we still face today: wildfire, pinyon juniper encroachment, intensive development in the form of renewable or non-renewable energy that's on the horizon, improper livestock grazing practices. We still face the disease issue with West Nile virus and subsidized predation. And sometimes that subsidized predation can be linked to other things, but what we see is ravens often are the beneficiary of some of these different things that are happening on landscape, and certainly do have, or potentially could have an impact on things like sage grouse nest success. Something that I hope is still not lost with folks is wildfire. From 1999 through 2007, wildfire affected approximately 40% of the active sage grouse leks in Nevada. That's 364 out of 912 leks. So, and it's a loss for some time. Some areas are coming back for sure, and where we had some rehab successes, we're seeing birds utilize again, but there's lower elevation Wyoming sagebrush habitat that's long-term been lost. That's oftentimes the winter habitat for the bird. These fires burned up approximately 2.6 million acres of key sagebrush habitat types within the range of greater sage grouse, and that amounts to about a 12% loss in just 9 years. This map depicts where those fires occurred from 1999 through 2007. I'm sure many of you have seen this map before, but those black dots represent the leks that were actually burned or within 3 miles of a burn where we could have had seasonal habitat that was impacted. Cumulative effects of energy development. There are a total of 135 active leks that are within the immediate rights of ways of energy development in some sort of form or fashion, and that's today, that's currently. There are some things that the BLM we're working with the BLM on right now that could potentially change that and would get it listing factor D. But when those leks are added to the number of leks that were burned, we get a number of 464 active leks that are either within those rights of ways or have been burned. That's about 51% of the total known active leks in Nevada. If some of that development is realized, you can imagine what the effects could be to the population. This map shows the existing rights-of-way in the state, and it's incomplete. It's an older map. Some things have changed since then, but those red areas are existing leases. And the number of leks that are within those rights-of-ways or within 3 miles of the right-of-ways, whether they're inactive, active, unclassified, was 210 active leks, there's 135 active leks within those areas. So we definitely need to figure out ways to address this issue. And that's it.
Okay, any of the commissioners have any questions or comments?
In the past few weeks, there was a wildfire burning in the Red Rock area, and a news report came on, and it talked about structures that were threatened, but it also said key habitat for sage grouse was being burned up. That's big that it's actually stated on the radio, because that means you guys are doing your job to get the message out that we need to be concerned about that. So that's the first time I heard it in a fire report, which was, I think, a big step forward. But are the agencies doing the fire suppression, working with you guys to identify the key habitats and do their fire suppression safe, so we can get islands of key habitats within a fire area?
That is encouraging that they have actually noted that, although I don't know the value of the Red Rock area in terms of sage grouse. That's probably not very high. So we do need to get them some updated maps. I'm not sure which version of these maps that they're using, but that goes back to that R-value map that I showed with all the colors on it, the yellow, the blue. That to me is the map that they should be using. If there's anything around the blue or the yellow, they should be working to put it out. But the good thing to note is that the BLM has been very good at working with us in placing higher priority on sage grouse habitat. It sits basically right behind life and limb, basically, in structures. So they have done a good job at placing a priority on that after several years of ranting and raving by agency biologists. So that's a good thing.
Commissioner McNinch.
Sean, I think even after your presentation, I think that it's really easy to underestimate the amount of work that's gone into the projects, into the planning, and dealing with things. I know that you were involved pretty significantly with a project with BLM that was more of a broader scale than just the state conservation plan, that there were a lot of meetings on that. I know of several projects that, I know of a couple projects that you spent 1 billion hours on that didn't go through, for various reasons, not for lack of effort or trying, but just to get any one of these projects done at these local PMU, at the local planning level, to get any one of these projects done is a tremendous amount of work. And just as an additional comment, there was a time, and I think that it's probably still kind of an estimate, but just on the long-term average, in Nevada, you have to plan. If you want to battle the fire issue alone, you have to deal with about 250,000 acres a year on the average. The long-term average, is that about right? It's pretty significant anyway.
Right, and that estimate, I believe that's come down a little bit based on the last few years, but yeah.
The point is that you had 71,000 acres. We burned up 2.6 million acres in a very short period of time back in late 90s, early 2000s, and you're talking about 71,000 acres here at the cost of $2.3 million. We're talking millions of acres burned, a lot of it being pretty decent some of it being pretty decent sage-grouse habitat. So it's pretty much an uphill battle, and you gotta start somewhere, and I appreciate all the effort. It's a lot of work.
Thanks.
Commissioner Ray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one of my other unpaid full-time jobs, volunteer fire department, I spend quite a bit of time, we talk about, various things dealing with wildfires. And I just spent quite a bit of time talking to BLM about it. And I've never seen, and as far as I know, the BLM agents out in that area don't have any particular priority maps that anybody's seen, or at least sure that not been focused around, well, certainly not at the local level, or that have never been circulated around. And to me, it seems like, that would be one relatively inexpensive thing to do. Shouldn't take too much effort. And probably just as important, if not more important than protecting the good ones, is the pinyon juniper habitat, other areas that should really be, don't extinguish fire, no control zones, as it really demonstrated on your map, and it's really applicable down, where I'm west, central portion of the state, and where I'm at, a lot of those areas, man, they could really use a match, and sometimes they get it, and they still get put out. And the federal government, local counties, and the state level are spending a lot of money to put out fires in the very areas where every deer biologist and you and bird biologists I see at NDOW, and as well as the BLM themselves, say, yeah, this really needs to burn. Yet we're still doing it, and I know that NDOW's not in charge of that, but NDOW has a say. And if it came from the department somehow that, hey, we would really appreciate it if you would take this into account, and you probably do that at times, but an emphasis, a real emphasis, because some of those areas I know that burned, and we had those fires in '99, some of those fires, that was some of the best restoration of habitat that could ever have happened. Because even though they were devastating in portions of them, and there was good habitat, there was other tens of thousands of acres that burned up that really needed it. Because it was just totally closed canopy, pinyon juniper, and now it's coming back into some of the most beautiful stuff anybody ever saw. And everybody knows that, but how to recreate, to allow that to happen in places that need it, because it's free when it's lit by nature. And the BLM, with the correct motivation and the right stick, and hopefully you guys have the right stick, will push that through. And the volunteer level, and I've done all that. Basically, volunteers. Somebody says, "Hey, don't go put it out down there. Thank you, we appreciate it. We're going home." It's not a hard thing to get them to go home. It's a really easy thing to get them to go. And also, it would really be appreciated at the local level, and I'm sure other counties are the same. That just from the local volunteers, hey, these are our priorities, and make them as small as you can, please. If somebody says, "Oh, all of Erie County's a priority," okay, well, whatever, throw the map away. But if it's this, then it's easy. Then you put it the priority right next to houses. Then you put that next, and it's an easy deal. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Trump, go ahead.
I've got a question for you. Over here in Lincoln County by Pioche, there by Table Mountain, Mount Wilson, they're contemplating, and the BLM is involved in a massive windmill farm. And of course, sage grouse are there, elk herds there. They're virtually going to destroy that area. Charlie and I have been to meetings where the BLM have put on, and NDOW representatives are there, I assume taking notes. So what's NDOW going to do, or what are they presently doing to, say perhaps throw water on this project, because it's not a good deal, any way you look at it. And it just pushes the sage grouse, possibly that much closer to being on the endangered species list, which would not help the sage grouse any at all. I can't think of any success story of anything that's been put on the endangered species list, with the exception of the bald eagle. The only thing the endangered species list is really good for is people like Council for Diversity or one of the other groups like that. They're so busy suing the wildlife services, that's where they get their extra money, and we pay for all that. Really doesn't help what's on the list. So my question is, what's NDOW doing about, say, this thing going on over there by Fields?
Oh gosh, Commissioner Shrum, I don't even know where to start with that because we've been a party to that project for 7 years now, and we've been underscoring the importance of that habitat for various species for that, at least that length of time. Lincoln County, I mean, we've partnered with them to try and get the project stopped. We've sent several letters to BLM. I would say that we've done almost everything in our power to tell the BLM that this is not a good spot for that project. And I'm not sure if you can comment on that, Jeremy, but you've certainly done a lot of work as well regarding that particular project. But it does not have any support from the local folks in Lincoln County. It really doesn't have support from anybody in the Ely area or Las Vegas. It's in the EIS process right now, basically. And this gets back to the lack of regulatory mechanisms that the Fish and Wildlife Service is talking about, listing factor D. There's nothing that gives us any regulatory teeth that says you are in priority sage grouse habitat, therefore you need to go look somewhere else. There's nothing that allows us to do that. And in fact, in a recent meeting, I told the BLM, in my 15 years, when something gets into the EIS process, you've never said no to a project. And they said, no, that can't be true. So they called up their state office, and it was true. They've never said no to any project. So that is exactly what the Fish and Wildlife Service is saying is one of the main problems.
I met with Dean Heller's staff when I was in Washington DC, and they're 120% dead set against the project. So Harry Reid's office, on the other hand, a little different story. So these, the political forces are starting to build, but there again, and the other problem that the BLM we've been hammering on at the national level is that these developers get in there and they start investing money, even though they know this is not a good place. Then the next card they play is, well, I've got $1 million invested in the planning of this project. How can you say no? And then more money and more money. So that's where we're really sitting. They need a regulatory mechanism to allow the BLM to just say no. And that's we're getting a lot closer to that.
Ken, how does $1 million relate to 12 billion invested in Dr. Mount? Money can't be the answer.
Commissioner Drew.
Just as a quick comment, follow-up to Sean, in regards to the Wilson Creek project. We've been involved in that, not as long as the department, but my observation has been that the department has been very proactive in expressing the wildlife concerns with that project. You know, it's a matter of receptiveness again at the BLM level, but I think the department actually has done a very good job at making sure those concerns are aired, and were aired early and often during the process. So, just as an observation.
Okay, there being no further comments from the commission, I'll go ahead and open it up for public comment. And we've got some cards here. Why don't we do the cards first, and then we'll follow up with anybody else.
Yes, no.
Tom Casanelli with Humboldt County Game Board. I want to go back to some of yesterday's comments on, I'm the ranching representative for Humboldt County, and I've been talking to a lot of ranchers and some organizations. And we had some big concerns on what was put on the agenda yesterday, which we've taken off, on closures of some of these units. The department already has in place, as we heard today, protection methods and counts. When they get to certain counts, they close these units. So I think we already have that in place. There's no reason to, and the benefits from these open units just outweigh the losses of the birds. I mean, the data we get and information, if we didn't have it, where would we be? We would have nothing on Sagen in this state without the department's help on this. So that's one reason I was pretty adamant about this yesterday. We go back in history to the start of when white man come into this country, the Sagen weren't that prolific. If we look at the journals and stuff of what they harvested on their trips through Nevada, you heard Sagen mentioned, but nothing like they would have been today. It sounds like it'd be, if we had the Sagen that we have today, back then it would have been a staple menu for them. They're eating horses and everything they could get because there just wasn't the wildlife. I wanted to expand on this at this time because I wanted to bring in like the issues on bobcats, what sportsmen do for these other species, and bears. I mean, it's gonna go right along. Everybody comes from their heart on hunting and canceling hunting, but the sportsmen of this state are the people that really have created the wildlife. And going back to the ranching industries, ranchers, where I consider them sportsmen of yesterday. I mean, and the farmers that come through this country, they expanded the country and opened it up for the wildlife we have today in this state. And to go after our sport, what we call a sport, I don't consider it a sport. I call it a love of nature and wildlife in itself. I mean, we're not out there trying to kill something. We're out there trying to propagate these animals. And that goes for the bears. I mean, you hear a lot from the bear people, and I understand it comes from their heart. It comes from their heart like it comes from the sportsman's heart. We're not out there to wipe out the bears off of, we want to see more. And I believe if we have a bear hunt along with this, you will see more. So
We're talking Sagen, so let's keep.
well, I think this has to go back in the bobcats. This all goes to the information we gain from each species through hunting, and that's what I'm trying to make a point of right now. The information that comes back to the state and to each species, sage hen, bobcats, deer, everything we get comes from sportsmen right now, and the money that goes into expand their habitats. A lot of it comes from sportsmen and from ranching. I mean, we're in the process of doing 2 sage hen projects ourselves on our little place. Hank Vogler is saying he's got projects for sage hen that are going on. I mean, but we definitely need the data to go along with it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Doug Bushman.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, for the record, Doug Busselman. I'm with Nevada Farm Bureau. I'm also an original member of the Governor's Sage Grouse Planning Group, and I have spent the last 8 or 9 years working on the bi-state population that was made mention of before. And to repeat some of the things that I said yesterday, we do believe that hunting is a very necessary and effective management tool that needs to be used where a huntable population exists in order to have sound management activities go forward. I think, though, that I'd also like to bring to the Commission's attention the need that we have, because of my background in doing what we've done so far. It's critical that we go forward and reevaluate the statewide plan, update it. There's efforts underway in several local areas to revisit the plans that were created a number of years ago and bring those up to date. And those are also essential, that we have sound conservation planning taking place that evaluates the current threats as well as the opportunities for restoration and enhancement activities. And we're committed to being involved in those kinds of supporting roles and participation at the local level as well as the state level. The comment that was made yesterday by Commissioner Vogler, though, I think indicates that his desire to have this particular topic put on the agenda went beyond just the hunting issue. There are, and I respectfully want to bring up, there are concerns that we have in rural Nevada as it relates to some of the activities. Right now, the Bureau of Land Management is going through a very much top-down kind of planning activity that has us on the edge of our seats, very concerned. The conservation plan process that we went through since 2000 involved the private sector directly engaged in the process in a very participatory fashion. And we're getting to a point where more and more we're seeing agency-to-agency cooperation, but we in the private sector are either being left out of the process or we're brought in to be told how things are going to be. And I think that's a concern that we have, and it's something that needs to be addressed in terms of bringing us back into line with that cooperation that we had earlier, and we'd like to participate in that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Floyd Rathman? Looks like Floyd's left. Okay, any other public comment on this agenda? Dr. Dixon?
Paul Dixon, Clark County. I had a question for Sean. It's kind of follow on to where Commissioner Robb and Commissioner Rain were headed in their line of questioning. When we talk about restoration of habitat, we've done that restoration of habitat during the end of the drought. In the last year and a half, we've started to come out of the drought as far as the climatic cycle, at least in Nevada. Other parts of the United States are going into drought. How successful was that restoration work we did during the drought? Has it all 71,000 acres on active restoration or been restored? I didn't understand that as a question, so maybe if you could answer that. Because I got asked this question.
Yeah, it's not a very easy question to answer. It's been met with variable success across the state. The fire rehabilitation efforts, if you're on the right facing slope, if you're on a north facing slope, you're at a little higher elevation, your chances of success are definitely going to be a lot higher. Some of the lower elevation stuff, it's pretty mixed. But I can say in some areas of the state that I've looked at recently, east of Midas, between Midas and Tuscarora, the country looks a lot better now than it would have been if we had done nothing. And I give kudos to the BLM for what they did out there and some of the seed mixes they used. They were very successful, and they did what they couldn't do it everywhere, but where they did it, it was successful, and we do have birds using that stuff again. So I was pleased with that.
The other thing we're working on is when you have a fire the following year, you have lots of money. Then the next year you only burn a small amount, you get no money. And so you improve that, and it doesn't work, fails for whatever reason. So we've been working at the national level to try to change our policies such that fire, that money falls into two pots: fire restoration, fire prevention. And they don't let you use that money that's used to fight the fire and the prevention side of it to do the restoration work. So we're trying to get flexibility built into their funding sources. So we have a funding stream that's constant, because ours is fairly constant, but it's the federal money, which is the big money, that goes up and down. So.
And then for the restoration you're doing for the greater sage grouse, what other species are benefiting from that? Because when I read and look at least at the Nevada test site, there was a series of studies that were set up by a lady in the 60s and 70s, and she ended off the USGS looking at habitat evolution over time through drought and other things. I'm trying to remember the guy's name, the USGS, that I could send you an email what he sent me. But we've been looking at least in southern Nevada, outside of the regions where you are, you've seen a pretty dramatic change in habitat with that study. You've also seen a dramatic change in the species, because as the habitat changed, species, when you went from sage to more of a grassland, or the things you have changed in species. So as you restore, are you restoring mainly for sage grouse, or are you restoring for a diversity of species?
I would say mainly it's restoring for a diversity of species with emphasis on sagebrush reestablishment. So anything that's a sagebrush obligate is going to respond favorably to that over time. However, it's going to take quite a bit of time to get back to that point. And often, if you're in a mountain sage community, it's 15 to 30 years. If you're in a Wyoming sagebrush community, lower elevation, it could be 50 plus years before you actually restored that habitat, and that's with a little bit of luck too. But pygmy rabbit, sage, the different various diversity species like sage sparrow and sage thrasher would benefit, but mule deer also benefit. Early successional beneficiaries are probably pronghorn.
Okay, that's kind of where I wanted to go. I mean, the timing piece of this is that it isn't, you do something and it's fixed tomorrow, and we've had an evolution change in our landscape, so to get back to things, it's gonna take, to get the habitat back a while.
And actually, the service at our EOC meeting said, look, we understand you guys across the West are doing great habitat stuff, and we also recognize it takes anywhere from 15 to 100 years, depending on the site that you're working in, to really recover it. And we're gonna give you credit for that. But what we're worried about, like Pac-Man game, is these core sage grouse areas are gonna get eaten up with development. And not grazing, not hunting, but development, energy development, those transmission lines, wind energy, geothermal, on and on, oil and gas, and that they need some assurance that those habitats are gonna be protected through time, so the habitat work can actually catch up. So it's those two things. So I think we have a chance here, actually, to succeed. And everybody's very, very serious about it. They also understand, once it becomes an endangered species, like mentioned earlier, then people start to back off, money starts to dry up. It's the Fed's problem, and that's not gonna be good in the long run.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean.
Any other members of the public? Mr. Harwell. Mr. Flowers, you're next.
Darrell Harwell, Washoe County. Here again, just to restate dead horse in the mouth or whatever. You have moved this to the September agenda on sage hen. And as we stated, Washoe County did not get any of these presentations or PowerPoint. And for me to try to explain to my board all the neat factors that I saw here, just, is there gonna be a way that what we saw today get out to the county advisory board so we can better help you in September with some recommendations? Thank you.
I think that's a good idea. I imagine that the department can go ahead and send out an email to all the county advisory boards and commissioners and go ahead and distribute the two slide presentations. I think it'd be good information for everybody to have. Mr. Flowers?
The only comment I would have on this is, when we saw the historical data here showing 20 to 30,000 birds being shot, that's when I first started hunting, 1961, that era. We were hunting at an earlier time of the year. I believe in some cases we were still hunting a 2-week period, and in some cases I believe the bag limit may have been 3 and 6 at that time. Those would definitely be factors that would impact our harvest at that time compared to today. And I would ask that somehow be noted so that people would understand why the variance. It's not that we lost the birds, it's the way we changed the time of year that we set the seasons and our bag limits.
Thank you. Lyndon Wall.
Thank you. Walt Mandeville, Lyon County. Many thoughts have been running through my mind over this past discussion because I've been involved with the sage grouse program for one heck of a long time. And I was born and raised in this state, and I can remember those early years when the birds would almost darken the sky. But there's been a lot of changes, and I've dealt with livestock people, For example, in the pine nuts, there was a meadow that had been hammered by horses and sheep, and then changes in the allotment and removal of the horses, that meadow came back. And now we have sage grouse using that. And the same thing with 9 Mile with the sprinklers on hay meadows or hay pasture. There's a lot of sage grouse utilizing that. So I see some positive things happening in the sage grouse area. Some other projects that have been approved by this commission are China Camp and some projects in the pine nuts involving pinyon juniper issues. I've seen the pinyon juniper on Sweetwater Summit. When I first started looking at sage grouse down there, we used to drive right down to the strutting ground and view the birds with no problem. Today, you can hardly drive through that stand. It's gotten so thick. And it's an encroachment problem that you can actually see over the years. It's just like a wave moving down off the side of the mountain. So those are a lot of issues. But at any rate, closing the season because of a threatened protection of this bird, I think would be a mistake at this time. And I think we need to continue our efforts. And I think it's just like was mentioned, nothing happens overnight, and most people like to see instantaneous results. And, you know, habitat takes a long time to change. It's beyond our lifetime in many instances, so we have to be patient. But at any rate, yeah, that's the comment, and the Lyon County Board supports the continuing season under the control that the Department of Wildlife has over it. We're satisfied. So thank you much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Paul. Anybody else on sage hen? Okay, this was an informational item. I guess the question I have for the director is that is there going to be anything, you know, should we be doing something, or should the state be doing something? You know, some suggestions about, you know, maybe ramping up the plan again and looking at things now that we've had this, the action of that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made under the Endangered Species Act. Should we be doing something now that that's occurred, and to maybe revisit all these issues and plans, and then, you know, take some additional steps? I mean, any suggestions there?
Well, Sean is continuing to work with the sage grouse, our Governor Sage Grouse team. You know, we're embedded in so many different things that are going on west-wide with the sage grouse technical team and the risk team that supports the executive oversight, on and on. That's one part of the presentation we need to expand so you can see all the things that we're involved in from a policy perspective and technical advice. I think it would be a good idea to have an update at every commission, because there's a lot of stuff going on, and by September we'll know more about the BLM plan. We could certainly have Raul or Amy come and talk about that. I'm sure they'd be glad about it. I'm leaving at 3:30 for a tour of Mount Grant and the bi-state and the colonel, the military. We're trying to get them to throw money in, and under the CICE Act they do have responsibility for endangered species on their property. So there's a lot of things that are going on, and I think every month or every 2 months, depending on when we have our meetings, there'll be enough things to be able to report on that. But we're not leaving any stone unturned at this point, because the bottom line is with the service, they're keeping a scorecard. And all these things add to a scorecard. Even the governor's proclamation about sage grouse is one thing. I think that's what I would suggest.
Okay, let's put it on as an informational item from here on out, and obviously every meeting that there's something to report, we can get the commission a report on that. Okay.